one of the founding members of the Tennessee Firearms Association. Also the executive director, longtime executive director. I'm not sure if we've had another one. I'm a member of the TFA as well and have been for several years, involved with the local chapter. So John, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
And obviously the hottest thing in Tennessee, the hottest issue right now is the red flag session that is tentatively scheduled by the governor for August 21st. Now we've talked about this before on the show. I had Richard Archie for the first show a few weeks ago, and we talked about that and the issues there and the concerns that this is going to be an infringement on our Second Amendment right and our rights under our Tennessee Constitution under Section 26. And as I understand it, a lot of the legislators have been invited to the governor's residence to talk about this, and I'm sure he's trying to convince them to go along with it. I'm inclined to think that there's way too many up there that will go along with it, but I know that there are certainly some opposed. What are you hearing from the legislators, and do you think there's any chance that he will call off the special session, as some have indicated?
Well, let's answer the second question first. I mean, Lee went out on a limb on April the 11th when he demanded that the legislature, while it was still in session, adopt a red flag law that he was proposing. Matter of fact, we understand that the draft of the red flag law that he put forth while the legislature was still in session was actually prepared by someone on his staff, as opposed to what you typically see in the legislature with the legislative legal services drafting the legislation. So he went out on that, and then when they told him basically, no, we don't want to do this, and they wrapped up session a little bit prematurely, passed a budget and went home, then he, before some of them even got across the state to get home, had put the word out that he was calling a special session to bring them back because he really, really wanted them to pass his red flag law. And he didn't feel like they had taken him seriously, apparently. So I don't see that at this point Lee is going to back off of his demand for a special session. Now, he could use the fact, for example, that the litigation involving the manifesto from the Covenant shooter is now tied up in the Court of Appeals, and it's unlikely that that issue is going to get resolved by August the 21st under the current briefing schedules. So he might use that as an excuse, but absent that type of exit strategy, he's really committed himself and his administration to forcing this General Assembly to come back into session. So the first part of your question really goes to, is there a chance that he could pass this thing? And I think we have to be very cautious, because although we have a lot of conservative legislators, predominantly the Republicans, saying that they don't want a red flag, that they will not support a red flag, we certainly don't have an overwhelming majority of all legislators saying that. Right. And here's the risk. Look at the House, for example, with 99 House members. 74 of them are Republicans in that supermajority, but 25 are Democrats. So he's halfway to the 50 point just by using the Democrats. And good and well, people like Justin Jones, Justin Pearson, Gloria Johnson are salivating at the chance to use this governor to pass a red flag law, just like they did maybe when they removed Forrest Buss from the Capitol. So then the question is, okay, there's 25 Democrats. Can we get 25 Republicans? And here's what tells me that they might be able to do that. 2 years ago, when the governor's permitless carry law was coming through the General Assembly, there were the same basic number of Republicans. And Speaker Sexton went on a Nashville radio show and said that the governor's bill, if it went to the floor as is, even though Sexton was supporting it, Chairman Lamberth was supporting it, it had all the leadership in support of it. Sexton thought that only about 59 to 63 of the House Republicans would even vote for that. So right off the bat, you lost as many as 14 or 15 Republicans to the Democrat side of the aisle on just a permitless carry law. And then Sexton was asked on that radio station, well, what if Representative Todd's amendment that would have made it truer constitutional carry were to get placed on the governor's bill. And in response to that question, Speaker Sexton said less than 50 House Republicans were expected to vote for it if it got amended. Now, if that carries through to a red flag law, then you have to anticipate that it's a very thin margin and likely a margin of 25 Democrats and 25 or more very weak Republicans that might support it in the House, and potentially the same type of dynamic in the Senate, where we already know that even though there's a Republican supermajority, we have a harder time passing pro-gun legislation in the Senate because of Lieutenant Governor McNally than we do passing it in the House.
Yeah, there's nothing really super about our supermajority. I mean, as far as trying to get anything conservative through. And so I did hear something the other day that somebody thought that maybe the governor was reconsidering. But another thing I've heard is I've heard a lot of legislators say, well, look, nothing's going to pass. We're not going to pass a red flag law. But I just, based on what you've said, and I knew most of that before you even said it, you already got 25 Democrats that are going to vote for it. We have at least 25 or 26 weak/suspect Republicans in the House that might be inclined to vote for a red flag law. So I think it's dangerous to have it for our rights. I also think it's a dangerous thing to have in the middle of summer when the session is out. We know what the left's going to do. They've already telegraphed it to some degree. We already know that they intend to make problems. So, he says this is for public safety, but he's going to create a public safety threat just by having this in August. And that's my thought anyway.
I think you're absolutely correct. He's going to create the crisis and the urgency just by the way he's manipulating these circumstances. I mean, he could have easily put it off and called the special session if he was going to have it in September or October, once the kids are back in school, so to speak. But no, he's pushed it forward right at the time that school's starting back up.
Yeah. It's a shame that with all the pressure for gun control coming from the federal government, from the Biden administration, it's a shame that here in Tennessee that we can't trust our governor, we can't fully trust our legislature, and that we're even having to contend with this. I guess we shouldn't be all that surprised, though, considering that Bruin passed, or Bruin was the decision made by the Supreme Court last year, and we saw how the administration resisted actually complying with Bruin. Complying with the Second Amendment is what they should have been doing, but they fought us tooth and nail. We talked about that on the first show. But Bill Lee really has no credibility on this issue at all. And I would hope that the legislature would see that, at least on this issue, that he can't be trusted.
I think that's a very good point. We in 2018, when he ran for governor the first time, he sent, rather than respond to our survey that we send out every 2 years to candidates, Lee wrote a 2-page letter to TFA on his own stationery, signed his own name to it, and proclaimed what a strong Second Amendment supporter he was. And then he specifically enumerated a number of issues that he was going to support if he became governor. And this year we've released that letter on our website, so it's there if people want to search for it. But I mean, he said things, for example, that he was going to support the constitutional rights. It's sort of a vague term, and clearly he hasn't done it. He said he would support constitutional carry. He ran a bill that he called constitutional carry, but that was, to borrow a phrase from Jack Johnson, that was just rebranding a crime bill that he and the House leadership and the Senate leadership wanted, and they just threw in this permitless carry topic that's really nothing but an affirmative defense to a criminal charge. You still have to prove that you were complying with the permitless carry conditions to a jury or convince a law enforcement officer that they're wasting their time prosecuting you. And then another thing that was in his letter is he promised that he would support legislation and sign legislation that authorized teachers to carry firearms on campus. And here we are 6 years later, and the closest he's come to that is spending a tremendous amount of money on school resource officers and things of that nature, but he's not even talking about letting teachers who want to carry be capable of doing so. So Lee's got no credibility as a Second Amendment advocate in this state, and I hope people are starting to see that, because there's no circumstances under which a true Second Amendment advocate would contemplate, particularly after the Bruin decision, the kind of proposal that Governor Lee is advancing today.
Another thing that raises the question of his credibility, well, really, it's not really a question anymore that he doesn't have credibility. I think you remember when he first announced, early days of his candidacy, and I remember hearing him at an event, and I think you heard this as well, that when he was asked about constitutional carry, he said that he opposed it because the Sheriff's Association opposed it, and that they didn't think it was a good idea and that he wouldn't support it. So we go from him saying that out the gate to later on sending the TFA a letter that, hey, I am the real Second Amendment advocate in this race. And then, of course, we see what happens once he gets in office. So, you know, that if you will be that deceptive and dishonest on one issue, I mean, I don't see how you can be trusted at all. And really, that ought to make the legislature, you know, leery of him. Not that some of them aren't just as bad, but really the guy has zero credibility. And I think he should be treated, at least on this issue, as somebody with no credibility.
I think you're right. He should be. But you got to keep in mind, Lieutenant Governor McNally has come out openly in news reports that he supports the red flag law concept. Some others have as well. Speaker Sexton has had numerous opportunities to put the nail in the coffin and say it's not coming through the House as long as I'm Speaker.
Right.
But what I've heard instead is let's put all the options on the table and consider them. I hear the same thing coming from, depending on what time you hear him saying it, from Caucus Leader Jack Johnson in the Senate, as well as Caucus Leader William Lamberth in the House. All of them are talking about, at this point, something has to be passed in the special session. And I'm talking the leadership players, and it's a question of what. And clearly, they're supporting Lee's effort to accomplish something. They just don't want to come out and tell their constituents or the citizens of Tennessee that their goal is to pass a red flag law and try to trick us by calling it something else, like a temporary mental health order of protection.
Right. And we already have rules, we already have laws on the books to take care of these kind of situations. We talked about that on the first show with Richard Archie. And that's another thing. There's no way that the governor doesn't know that those codes already exist. I'm sure somebody has told him, hey, this is actually already here. So to me, that's just another case of him wanting to pass a red flag law. Like you said, they want to do something. And it's scary when politicians just want to do something, because we're the ones who usually come up with the short end of the stick when that's all said and done. And in this case, it'll be our rights. Not to mention, like say, all the inherent dangers with having this session in August, and rather than waiting till the normal session is in. And so I'm just hoping that it doesn't happen. I'm hoping that either he can be talked out of it, probably not, or that at least the best we could hope for is when they show up, maybe there's a motion to adjourn and they do what they did to Bill Haslam with the Medicaid expansion, his attempt at Medicaid expansion back during his term. That's, I think, the best we can hope for.
Yeah.
So I mentioned the TFA a minute ago, or excuse me, the ATF a minute ago. We were talking, and there are some current cases. Obviously, you can't, violate any trust. But can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing the ATF do here in Tennessee? While our governor is trying to stick it to us over our Second Amendment rights, we also have the ATF here in Tennessee. Can you talk a little bit about some of that stuff that you're dealing with?
Yes, I mean, this isn't really a TFA issue. This has more to do with my law practice, and I've been a practicing attorney in Tennessee now for right at 38 years, and for almost 3 decades of that, I have been involved with representing gun dealers and gun manufacturers and explosives companies in disputes with the ATF, and that's a small part of what I do but compared to other attorneys, it's a significant amount because there just aren't many attorneys that want to take on the ATF or the federal government to begin with. So what we have seen with the ATF really over the last 20 plus years now is an increasing aggression directed towards what I call the Second Amendment supply chain. That is targeting, they've realized they're not going to really be effective at passing gun control through Congress because there's still too tight a balance between the Republicans and the Democrats. So what the ATF has done is they've weaponized the statutes and they've weaponized the regulations so that they can attack the supply chain, meaning they are attacking manufacturers, wholesalers, distributors, and retail dealers. And I represent those people on a regular basis in disputes with the ATF, mainly license revocation or license denial hearings. And what's happened in the last 2 decades and has accelerated monumentally under the Biden administration is that ATF is using its regulatory compliance authority, and they are redefining categories of violations, basically paperwork errors in most instances, things that 15, 20 years ago would have been a warning letter or an admonition, but didn't put you out of business.
Right.
Now they've taken the position under the Biden enhanced enforcement policies that certain violations are automatic. You lose your license. It doesn't matter really what your excuse is. If this violation occurs, then you're going out of business. And a lot of people, a lot of dealers are small dealers where the volume of their business doesn't justify litigating with the ATF. So we've lost a lot of dealers already. We're losing more day by day. But there are some dealers that are big enough, that have financial enough interest, that they don't have a choice. They've got to fight or they got to go into bankruptcy. And I'll give you an example of one of the issues. ATF will take the position, for example, that when a dealer runs a background check, they only have 30 days, regardless of what the background check results are, 30 days from the date of the initial check to transfer possession of that firearm if it gets approved. And if the 30 days runs, they've got to do another background check. Well, with TBI in particular, there's an issue that TBI, although it's required by law to respond to an appeal of a denial within 15 days, they don't do it. And so I've got a dealer right now that I'm working with where they ran the background check. There was a denial. The person appealed it. And then TBI reversed themselves and issued an approval. The problem was the approval that was issued by TBI was past the 30 days. They didn't even respond within 15, much less within 30. It was after the 30 days. And within 3 days of getting that approval, the dealer made the transfer, thinking that the 30 days ran probably from the date of the approval, which makes sense, rather than the arbitrary date of the first run. Well, the way the ATF sees that is that once the 30 days runs, that first background check, even if there was an approval on it, has to start over again. And a transfer, even if it was on the 31st day, is a transfer to an unlicensed individual without running any background check. And so they deem that under the new Biden policy as an immediate revocation issue. And I've got a number of dealers who have run into that problem. For example, they do a background check in a month with 31 days. They look at the calendar and say May the 15th to June the 15th is beyond the 30 days, whereas June the 15th to July the 15th is the 30th day. And so simple little calendar oversights is being taken advantage of by the ATF as a basis for revocation. And they're not going to stop. They're becoming more aggressive with it. And really, one of the few options we have with Biden still in office is for the Republican-controlled House to literally take funding away from the ATF to the point that it alters their revocation policies going forward.
Let me ask, now, I doubt there's any inclination, but if there is there a state agency or any part of the state government that could intervene in those situations if they were inclined?
Well, potentially, yes. I mean, first thing is TBI should be reprimanded by the legislature and the governor's office for failing to timely do these background checks. That's part of the problem. They got a 15-day deadline, but there's no consequences to TBI or its staff if they don't abide by the 15 days. The victim becomes the dealer and the victim becomes the citizen when the administrative branch of government under Bill Lee, TBI, fails in its statutory duties. The second thing is it's potentially possible that the state, relying upon the 10th Amendment, could raise the Bruin issue and assert basically that based on Bruin, the federal government has no statutory authority or constitutional authority to regulate the supply chain in the Second Amendment to begin with, because under Bruin, laws that didn't exist in 1791 can't be enforced now if they infringe the Second Amendment. The ability to purchase and sell firearms is clearly within the scope of the Second Amendment. The capacity to manufacture firearms is clearly within the scope. I think the state and other states could likely raise issues on behalf of their citizenry and on behalf of these dealers that licensure by the ATF at this level, revoking based upon paperwork errors, is a material violation of the Second Amendment, that Bruin prohibits it, and there should be an injunction against the ATF. I'm not aware of a single attorney general anywhere in the nation that's going down that path at this point. But the question is, why not? Why is Tennessee's attorney general not looking at that if there's an attack on the Second Amendment supply chain in the state, and that attack violates the Bruin standards?
And he's aware of Bruin, and matter of fact, I think on one issue, I think it was the 18 to 20-year-old issue, the state already had to concede basically rewriting Bill Lee's so-called constitutional carry / permitless carry. They had to backtrack on that and comply. Is that already in effect?
There was a settlement agreement that was submitted in a federal case in East Tennessee that is currently known as the Beeler versus Long decision, where the Attorney General's office entered into a settlement agreement that stipulated that Bill Lee's permitless carry law and the existing two statutes on permits, to the extent they restricted 18 to 20-year-olds from getting permits or to carrying without a permit, the stipulation in that settlement says those restrictions violate the Second Amendment, they violate the 14th Amendment, and they constitute federal civil rights violations. So the state attorney general has already recognized the impact of Bruin and entered into that settlement agreement in that one case. Now, it's important to understand, because of the way they wrote that settlement agreement, is it only enjoins and restricts the Department of Safety. So right now, while the Department of Safety may have to issue you a permit if you're 18, 19 years old and otherwise eligible to get it, a local law enforcement officer or a local district attorney is not enjoined. They could literally still try to prosecute you for that, because the injunction is only as pertains to the Department of Safety.
Do you see that being expanded anytime soon?
Well, I think it has to be expanded. It seems to me ridiculous to make the argument that for a court to enter an order approving a settlement agreement which stipulates that 3 Tennessee statutes violate the Second Amendment, it's ridiculous to construe that agreement, that order, as saying it only applies to the Department of Safety. There's no way, if it's unconstitutional, it's got to be unconstitutional statewide for any government official to try to enforce it. But the Attorney General's office, in a hearing that we just had last Thursday in Gibson County, made the argument that that settlement in Beeler only applies to the Department of Safety, and that local sheriffs and local district attorneys and either other state agencies, TBI, for example, could still try to enforce the 18 to 20-year-old restrictions.
Do they do that with any other issue? That just seems to me like this is something that they try to just do when it comes to the Second Amendment. They don't seem to construe things this way with other issues. It seems to me like it's more just a second. You know of anything else where they try to say, well, it's only a violation if this agency does it, it's not a violation if that agency does it?
Well, now I'm not aware of that argument being advanced in any other area. And for most people, if they read that settlement agreement and it stipulates that the statutes violate the U.S. Constitution in multiple respects and constitute civil rights violations, most people would not perceive that to be limited only to one specific agency, and that other state law enforcement officials would not be similarly acting in violation of the Constitution by attempting to enforce those statutes. That may be the way it's written, but that's a preposterous interpretation, and it puts our citizenry in Tennessee and our visitors from out of state at substantial risk for government abuses if that's the way they want to play this game.
You know, for years now, the TFA has, you have a legislative action committee that's raised money to put in good candidates at the State House. And I would say that most of the ones that you supported that are good on the second, they're good on many of the other issues. But, you know, at some point in time, you've been at this for so long trying to just replace all the bad actors up there. And so is litigation maybe a better, is that going to be a better option than continuing to try to just replace the bad actors up there?
Well, I think litigation is a tool we've had to add to the repertoire of options that Tennessee Firearms Association has and that Tennesseans have in general. You know, when I started doing this, when TFA came into existence, we had Democrat governors, Democrat lieutenant governors, and Democrat speaker in the House, and the Democrats controlled. And despite that, we were able to work situations with rural Democrats, basically conservative Democrats, and Republicans, and pass stuff and get it into law that made at least incremental steps towards getting us to the Second Amendment. But for years, the first 15 years or so, we were constant, when I say we, TFA was constantly promised by the Republican Party, the Republican candidates, the Republican minority leaders, that if you help us get the majority in the General Assembly, if you help us control the governor's office, we will strengthen the Second Amendment rights in Tennessee. We will remove the infringements on those rights. And they got that power, and we helped them get that power 13 years ago. And they have done very little, if anything, to carry forward and implement those promises. And more often than not, what we have heard is TFA who? They act like we're a non-issue and we don't exist, when all we're saying is, guys, you made us promises. Are you going to keep them? And not just promises. Now the Supreme Court says this is the law. This is how the Constitution applies. Are you just going to abide by what the Supreme Court has ordered? And yet we see resistance even this year before the Covenant shooting to moving forward with things like real constitutional carry, getting rid of gun-free zones, eliminating restrictions so that it was no longer just a handgun permit, but it would be a firearms permit or the capacity to carry firearms without a permit. All these things are required by Bruin, and yet we rolled into the General Assembly session this year pre-Covenant, and they were fighting us on all of those topics. And the fight came from legislative leadership and these Republicans that are on the far left.
Which there's way too many of those. People would be surprised. You know, I know people come to Tennessee from other states and they think they're coming to a conservative state. Well, the people are conservative, but our elected officials, not so much. I mean, we're pretty much purple when you consider the legislature overall. And the Senate, definitely. Our Senate is as bad as our House is. At least we have probably 20, 30 good, solid guys. But when
Well,
it comes to the Senate,
exactly,
it's pathetic.
exactly. And, you know, it's not just guns. You know, Republicans run, you hear it every time they run, every 2 years. Smaller government, lower taxes, you know, more efficiency. When the Republicans got control in 2010, the state budget was only about $28 billion.
Right.
28 billion 13 years ago. That was under Democrat control. The budget they just passed this year, I think, is $57 billion, an increase of more than 100% in 13 years. That doesn't sound like smaller government, lower taxes.
No.
That sounds like a nanny state where they're raising the money, but instead of giving it to welfare recipients, they're giving it to the Titans, and they're giving it to Ford Motor Company and every other big business that they can seduce into coming to Tennessee. And it's all on the back of working Tennesseans.
Absolutely. And at the same time, they bring in all these illegals to take the jobs from Tennesseans. But that's a whole nother show. So you have been involved with some lawsuits. I know that the TFA, and I imagine you in your personal capacity as well, have done some amicus briefs for some different Supreme Court cases.
Yes, we started intently about, well, we've done some before, but it really picked up in 2019. And right after, you know, Lee comes into office. And in the last 4 years, we have done over 15 federal amicus briefs where we have filed essentially friend of the court briefs. In most instances, we've done those in conjunction with Gun Owners of America or the Second Amendment Foundation. But we work with other national groups. So, for example, I'm presently representing Tennessee Firearms Association and retired Sheriff James Hammond from Chattanooga in the Covenant Manifesto litigation. And that's being backed by Judicial Watch, which is now one of the organizations that sees value in some of the work that Tennessee Firearms Association is trying to do. We're also an amicus party in the litigation against TWRA on its interpretation of the law that they say gives them authority without ever getting a search warrant to come onto your property and check to see if you might be illegally engaged in or inappropriate hunting activities.
Right. So you've got the 501c4 and you've got the PAC, and now you have a 501c3, or you've recently filed to have a 501c3?
TFA started off in 95 and got recognized by the Internal Revenue Service as the 501c4. That's the longest standing entity. And that a 501c4 is a nonprofit. It's not a charity, despite what the state of Tennessee tries to claim. A C4 is recognized by the IRS as issue advocacy, which means it can fully engage in political action. It cannot, however, support or oppose a specific candidate for public office, and contributions or membership fees to them are not tax deductible, but it is itself tax exempt. In 96, we formed Tennessee Firearms Association Legislative Action Committee, TFA LAC. That's the state PAC for TFA. That's where we raise money and hold our annual events to support candidates that we think are better than what's currently there, to support candidates that have supported our issues if they've got challengers, and to try to defeat candidates like we did in 2012 when we took out Deborah Maggart that we think are actively working against Second Amendment issues. Now, this year in May, we filed the paperwork to start the Tennessee Firearms Foundation, which we've applied for true 501c3 charitable status with the IRS. We hope to get an answer on that potentially in July, if we're fortunate. And its mission will be to leverage the ability of our donors to help fund educational outreach, teaching people about the Second Amendment, teaching people about things like the Bruin decision, and expanding that knowledge base, as well as funding public interest litigation, things like the amicus litigation that we've done, or the litigation over in Gibson County where we're fighting the Parks statute.
Okay. Now, the fundraiser, the annual fundraiser, is September 9th. It's in Lebanon at the fairgrounds. It's in the Farm Bureau building. And we've had them there for the
Correct.
last couple of years. Good turnout. Had, I think last year was, the biggest year as far as what we brought in.
Absolutely. It was our biggest year ever. We grossed about 85,000, netted about 65,000. And since the TFA-LAC doesn't have paid staff, which mainly run with volunteers, all of those net proceeds stay in Tennessee to benefit battles or efforts to elect strong Second Amendment candidates, or particularly within the Republican primaries, to get rid of the ones that roughly a third of them that's there now that just won't support Second Amendment issues.
Right. Now, this year, I know we don't have everything finalized and we can't say, we can't necessarily throw names out there, but you've already sold some tickets, you already sold some tables. The early bird specials are going to end here pretty soon. And in addition to just that reason alone, people need to think about buying their tickets, but we might have some people coming to speak that people are really going to be interested in. And obviously you can't give names out, but what could you say to encourage people that they might really want to think about getting their tickets now?
Well, you're exactly right. Last year we rented a portion of the facility where we could accommodate up to about 450 people. And we sold almost that many tickets, but you always have some people that get sick at the last minute or something comes up and they don't attend. So we had over 350 show up last year. Gun Owners of America sent Eric Pratt, their senior vice president, in as our guest speaker. It was a phenomenal event. We did really well. We had some big sponsors last year. This year, things are looking really strong. We had one donor step up when I had a meeting with him early on, and he basically wanted to know, what was your total cost to run the event last year, which was about $21,000. And he said, look, I like what y'all are doing. I'm really proud of what you're trying to do, particularly with volunteer efforts. And he said, I'm going to underwrite 20,000, which ought to cover almost all of the event expenses for 2023. Now, that was before we knew we potentially are going to get a high profile guest speaker. And we should know that for certain this week.
This week?
But we've already sold over 50% of the number of tickets and tables that we sold last year. We've picked up Smith & Wesson as a major sponsor this year. We've picked up Firearms, which owns Auto Ordnance, the Tommy Gun Company, as a major sponsor this year. We've got Congressman Green back. He's increased his sponsorship level this year. So things are really looking strong. And then we had a couple of events happen, which made us a pathway to get this particular keynote speaker interested enough to come in and talk with us about it. Frankly, what's going to happen is if we get that contract signed potentially this week, the cost of putting on this event are going to more than double, substantially more than double. So we're treating all the tickets that we sell up until we announce the end of the early bird, which could be as early as this week, are locked in prices, and the prices are going to go up probably about a third. So a $60 ticket might become an $80 ticket, because what we've got to look at is how much more do we need to raise to cover the cost of the guest speaker, and how much of that can we cover with additional donor monies that are earmarked specifically for the guest speaker. So $60 tickets right now on early bird, they may become $80 tickets as early as this Thursday or Friday. Table tickets right now have a price at $350 for 6 to a table. We're likely going to go to 8 to a table. And if we factor in the individual ticket price increases, the 8 to a table tickets will probably be somewhere around 600, maybe 650. I haven't done the math. I'm just rough numbers right there. But it's necessary because I think there's a lot of people that are going to want to see this guest speaker. We're talking now with our catering company and the venue about going from 350 served to serving as many as 900 to 1,000 people. The meal, the event, hosting them, bringing in the extra chairs, all of that. So there's a lot more cost involved if this anticipated speaker gets, under contract this week.
Yeah, and there'll be no more of this TFA who that you might hear from some in the legislature if this pans out.
We would hope so, but with what we've been able to do with, beating people like Deborah Maggart in 2012 and taking out some other House members and a few others in primaries, for example, you would have thought the TFA who would have gone away a long time ago. But, and you've heard it yourself, there are legislators that will say things like, well, if TFA wrote the bill or if TFA supports the bill, it's dead on arrival. Well, that's just an outright violation of their constitutional oath to consider legislation without prejudice. And what the fact is there's some of them up there that don't like the fact that we identify them as violating their oaths or violating the Second Amendment, or they don't like the fact that in the past we have targeted and gone after incumbents and beaten them because they wouldn't support the Second Amendment.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going to be a great event, even if this one doesn't, this big name doesn't pan out. I think it will pan out, and I think you're definitely going to get a lot of attention. Now, something I saw about a week ago, and I just want to hit this for a minute. I think you were somewhere, and somebody said that, well, when I'm retired or when I get through with this or get through with that, then I'll get involved when I've got time. But you're a full-time attorney. And you do all this stuff. I mean, you're not a paid employee. We don't have paid employees in the TFA. I think you may have some part-timers, but we're not the NRA. And this is a volunteer force.
It is. The TFA's board, their executive officers, their administrators, even their chapter leaders like you, we're all volunteer. Yeah. There are a few people that we pay to do things like process membership forms and applications because that's work that's got to be done that I can't count on volunteer labor to do. But aside from that, almost everything else that TFA accomplishes is accomplished by volunteer effort. I know Richard Archie, who's on your first show, puts in, 20, 25, 30 hours a week doing what he does, going out public speaking, doing it on his time, paying his own fuel cost. All of that is not only volunteer, but it's commitments out of our own pockets. And I'm the same way. I will typically, in addition to my full-time law practice, I will have anywhere from 20 to 40 hours a week of additional things that I do that are donated to TFA or the PAC or now the foundation. And it's because we see this as a commitment that requires skin in the game to succeed. And that's, I think that brings up the point you made is we had a post up on the Facebook page about, people responding to calls to action. And so commonly, and it's almost infuriating that I see conservatives respond back with, well, liberals don't have a job, but I do. Well, okay, fine. So do I. So does Richard. So do you, Dave. But we find the time because it's important to push these issues forward. And sitting on the couch and being a spectator because they got a day job isn't an excuse. And if that was an excuse, TFA would have never have accomplished what we've accomplished in the last 30 years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If we could put the website up, and that's another thing, the website, even if you're not a member, you can go to the website. You can get the updates, what's going on when the session is in, and find out, what bills are up. John does a thorough analysis. Hey, here's the bills we're supporting, the bills we're opposing, the bills maybe we haven't decided on yet, or they don't really fit in the Second Amendment, but we think they're important and we put them up there. And you don't have to be a member to see that. You don't have to be a member to read the articles that John does and Richard. And there's also podcasts. Richard does some really good podcasts explaining things, and his podcasts are probably less than 10 minutes. So there's a lot of good information put on the website, and I would encourage everybody at TennesseeFirearmsAssociation.com. That is a website with a lot of good information. Well, John, I appreciate you coming on, appreciate your time, appreciate what you do. I look forward to hearing that big announcement this week.
We hope, I had a long call today. We hope we'll be able to make the announcement as early as Wednesday or Thursday if the contract comes through and we're able to sign it.
Well, good. I hope so. Hey, thanks again. You take care, and we'll try to have you on again at least once before the special session.
Well, I've appreciated it very much, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. You heard us mention the 10th Amendment, and the 10th Amendment's very important. That's one of the things we'll focus on in this show. And just as a reminder, we've started a 10th Amendment organization in the state. There's a lady in East Tennessee named Karen Bracken. She's the founder. I'm the co-founder. And the organization is Tennessee Citizens for State Sovereignty, so it's tncss.com. Or excuse me, Weebly.com. And then the main form of communication will be through the Substack account, so tncss.substack.com. Hey, if you like the show, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Next week, our guest will be Kathy Henners from Daily Roll Call. She'll talk about some of the threats you might not be aware of in Tennessee. Thank you for joining us. See you next week. Thank you.